Hi, everybody. Going to give y'all a couple minutes to jump on. Hope everybody's having a fabulous Wednesday. Last Wednesday of August. Can't believe we're already falling into fall time. This year is flying by. Everybody's kind of jumping on. So we got a great presentation for you today. I'm really excited. So I'm going to go ahead and get started because most people don't have already heard my front end spiel. But hi, everybody. My name is Christy Weeks. I am the brand and digital media manager for Harmony Foundation. And I'm so grateful that y'all joined us today for the 2022 Harmony webinar series, Improving Addiction and Treatment Outcomes Through a Relational Approach, How the Opposite of Addiction is Truly Connection. And our presenter today is Gabrielle Weinshank. She is an LMFT out of Mountainside Treatment Center in Connecticut. So real quick, I'm going to kind of roll through some details on Harmony for everybody who's new. We are nestled on a 43-acre campus up in the base of the Rocky Mountain National Park in Estes Park, Colorado. And we are a residential rehab that offers comprehensive treatment for adults and their family members. So who we are is we absolutely believe that long-term recovery is absolutely possible. We have over 50 years of treating addiction, and we have fostered a generation of long-term recovery who supports our clients and families for a lifetime. Our staff at all levels of the organization work together to create a community of recovery support. We have approximately 70 beds in our residential treatment program. We also offer medical detox and have an IOP program that is virtual, as well as a very, very strong alumni program that we're very proud of. We offer evidence-based 12-step program that is gender responsive. And if you have any questions about Harmony and the services that we offer, feel free to visit us at harmonyfoundationinc.com, or you can contact our admissions staff at the number on the screen, which is 866-686-7867. So a few things I definitely want to review before we get started. Oh, there's my office mate. She jumped up here and joined us. Couple of housekeeping things. Please be sure to fill out the survey that comes at the end of the presentation. If you happen to miss the link when it pops up, I will send it out to you in your email with your CE certificate. So that information is very important to us. It helps us figure out who we need to bring on for our future presentations and get very honest feedback from y'all on what you're looking for. I will be sending out your certificate via email, and you should receive it by end of day on September 2nd, Friday. Now, with that, please, please, please check your junk emails because that's where my emails tend to go. So if you don't see it by end of day Friday, check there. If you can't find it, reach out to me. I'll be sure to get it to you. You can get me at cweeks@harmonyfoundationinc.com, and I'll be sure to help you out. We will be recording this presentation as we do with all of ours. So by end of day Friday, you will also find this presentation on our website under the professional CEU series tab. So if you have an interest in rewatching this or want access to the slides that are within this, please be sure to check our website because that's where you'll find it. And unfortunately, at that point, it is not eligible for a CEU credit. So, but it is there for your reference, as are all our previous webinars. So with all of that being said, I'm going to roll in and I'm going to introduce our lovely presenter today. Gabrielle Weinshank has earned a Master's of Family Therapy degree as well as a licensure as a marriage and family therapist in the state of Connecticut. Gabrielle has been working in the field of addiction treatment for years in various capacities. Currently, Gabrielle works at Mountainside Treatment Center as a family wellness clinician. At Mountainside, Gabrielle facilitates various psychoeducational group offerings for the individuals in residential treatment and facilitates psychoeducational group offerings for family members of Mountainside clients. Additionally, she maintains a caseload in which she conducts individual and family therapy sessions, creates a group curriculum on family dynamics, facilitates webinars and other educational offerings for community providers, and writes articles for Mountainside's blog. Gabrielle is passionate about including families in the addiction treatment process and works to integrate her expertise in family systems theory with her knowledge of addiction treatment to best serve her clients' needs. So before I turn everything over to Gabrielle, I want to say thank you to Mountainside for their partnership. And if you would like to learn more about any of the services that Mountainside provides, please be sure to head to their website. One last thing before I turn it over, if you have any questions during this presentation, please be sure to enter them into the chat box. Gabrielle will be answering questions periodically. She's going to glance at them and then definitely circle back at the end. So use the chat box. We'd love to hear from you. So I'm going to stop share on mine and turn it over to Gabrielle.
Thank you so much, Christy, and just bear with me as I move to share my screen here. All right. Sorry, just one moment. I lost my view here. Excuse me for, there we go, technical difficulties.
No worries, I have them all the time.
Thank you all so much for joining me. And again, thank you, Christy, for the introduction. My name is Gabrielle Weinchenk. Most people call me Gabby though. And as mentioned, I'm a marriage and family therapist working at Mountainside Treatment Center in Canaan, Connecticut as a family wellness clinician. Thank you for joining me as I get this lovely opportunity to speak to you about something I'm very passionate about, which is improving addiction treatment outcomes through taking on a relational approach. As a marriage and family therapist and systems thinker, I've always wanted to include families in treatment. However, when we start looking at the neurobiology of both addiction and relationships, it becomes even more compelling how the opposite of addiction is truly connection. And it's an honor to get to speak to you guys about that today. Before I get too far into the webinar, two housekeeping things for me. First off, again, I want to encourage you to ask questions throughout. Really, I want to make this information relevant to your clinical practice. So please use the Q&A or chat feature. And like Christy said, I'll periodically take a look, and we'll also have a Q&A at the end. The other thing is I just want to give a shout out to my colleague, Courtney Hulse. She's a fellow licensed marriage and family therapist and the program manager of our Huntington location. Courtney was integral in compiling the research to be able to give you this webinar. So thank you, Courtney. She wasn't able to join me here today to help facilitate, but just wanted to give her that shout out. So today we're going to be talking about improving addiction treatment outcomes through a relational approach. And our objectives are, first off, I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain and the neuropsychology of addiction. So how does the brain change over the course of active addiction? Now, because we only have an hour, I'm going to keep this basic and brief just to give an overview to frame the rest of what we'll talk about. Next, we'll go on to discuss oxytocin, a social neuropeptide, and why it's a protective factor for addiction. We'll talk about oxytocin as it relates to healthy relationships, as well as navigating the recovery process. And then lastly, I'll go over some interventions that are relationally informed so that you can hopefully utilize them in your work to improve your treatment outcomes. So as mentioned, the first thing I'm going to talk about is the neurobiology of addiction, or the hijacked brain as we refer to it. What we're looking at right now is a side slice of the brain with two components that are highlighted. The pleasure principle, which are these three components grouped together, the nucleus accumbens, amygdala, and the hippocampus. And we're looking at the cerebral cortex. And more specifically, the prefrontal cortex is also really important to understand when we're looking at addiction. Right now in this moment, my prefrontal cortex is the CEO of my brain. It's the highest executive, and in the average adult, that's true. It's what allows me to consider short-term and long-term consequences, weigh things like risk and reward, really all of my critical thinking and executive functioning. In a nutshell, over the course of active addiction, the CEO, or prefrontal cortex, gets demoted. And what starts calling the shots and takes its space is the pleasure principle. Now, critical thinking, I need that as an adult, right? It's pretty essential to show up in the world the way that adults need to, but it's not something we're born with, and it's not really essential for survival, so to speak. What does help us stay safe and optimizes our chance of survival is our pleasure principle and the areas of our brain closer to the brain stem as the brain develops from back to front. So the whole job of the pleasure principle is really to keep us safe, to optimize our chances for survival, which really means to help us make meaning of what to go towards, what things give us pleasure, what things will keep us safe, and also to make meaning of what's dangerous, what should we go away from or fight, flight, or freeze. How that happens is, based on what's going on around us, little chemical messengers or neurotransmitters are going to be released that inform certain behavioral responses. So, right now, if in this moment, I pulled out an orange candy bar wrapper, what am I talking about? If I could see your faces, I'd probably see people mouthing Reese's peanut butter cups. If you got that, then that means at some point in your life, your pleasure principle made meaning that that's something that is going to keep you safe, right? It gives you sustenance. Food is something that we need to survive, but also gives you pleasure. Chocolate is delicious. So really what was happening was, someone presented you that candy bar wrapper, you opened it up, you smelled the chocolatey goodness, you tasted it. Dopamine, which is that pleasure, a neurotransmitter, was released in your brain and, with the assistance of the nucleus accumbens, and then the hippocampus is like a memory stamp, drew that association. Orange candy bar wrapper, chocolatey goodness. How powerful is our pleasure principle that you didn't have to see it, you didn't have to taste it, you didn't have to smell it. I just said orange wrapper and you knew that that was a Reese's peanut butter cup. Well, again, that's because this part of our brain is really powerful. Now, something like chocolate, things like food, sex or reproductive behavior so that we can, prolong the human species, water, shelter, things that we need, we're going to get just a little bit of dopamine. I refer to as like a ×1. So really in that example I gave, you're smelling the chocolate, you're getting a little dopamine. You're tasting it, you're getting a little bit of dopamine. Then you swallow and it's synthesized and you return to baseline. We'll naturally experience a gradual rise and fall of dopamine, and glutamate is another really important neurotransmitter to know because dopamine and glutamate are what bring us that sensation of pleasure and motivation, as well as imprint the memory so that we have kind of like a filing cabinet of the things that we want to go towards. Now, substances. Substances create an unnatural, inorganic, and frankly, unrealistic amount of dopamine in the brain where instead of a ×1, it's a ×10. Imagine dirt roads versus highways. And remember, this part of our brain is built for survival, to keep us safe. So really what that means is go towards the things that give us the most dopamine. So when we introduce substances into the brain, what you see is people turning away from everything they once turned towards because there's almost this tunnel vision. Like the amount of dopamine is so compelling that the brain is quite literally shouting at them, go seek that out, that thing that provides, such pleasure, such motivation, such reward. So the things I hope that you take away from this that'll frame the rest of what we talk about is dopamine and glutamate are really important neurotransmitters for addiction, that there are certain mechanisms in the brain that create that reward association and drive us towards seeking things out. And when it comes to substance use, the baseline amounts of dopamine lower because the receptors really get impaired from that continued use of just flooding the brain and having it all be absorbed. So next, we're going to talk about the neurobiology of relationships. And the phrase, the opposite of addiction is connection, has really floated across recovery spaces for decades. I know that I've heard it a lot. And research is beginning to look at how that's true on a physiological level, looking at the brain and some overlapping mechanisms between addiction and connection. And what they're looking at there is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is an emerging area of interest, so I do want to throw out a couple caveats here. This is all very new, so there aren't hard and fast theories. It's just something we're coming to understand and look at, not just for addiction, but for other behavioral health treatment. So some things like, they're looking at the treatment of, autism spectrum disorders, eating disorders, trauma, OCD, and how oxytocin seems to play a role similar to how it might play a role in addiction treatment. So again, just keep that in your back pocket that this is all very new. And then some of the research that I'm going to be sharing with you today is exogenous oxytocin administration. And what I mean by that is it's not my body's natural production of oxytocin. Sometimes, especially in the animal studies, I'll talk about rodents, they're being administered oxytocin. So holding that up to some of the interventions that I'm going to talk about, I don't administer oxytocin to my clients, right? So I'm going to be talking about things that are natural and holistic, but just take that into consideration as we're reviewing some of the research today. All right, so what is oxytocin? Oxytocin is a neuropeptide, and neuropeptides are chains of amino acids. Now, casually, people refer to oxytocin as the love hormone or the social neurotransmitter, and that's because a lot of the functions of it are relational. Now, I mentioned dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters and neuropeptides are similar, but they're different. Neuropeptides are slow acting and they produce a chain of prolonged action, whereas neurotransmitters, it is fast acting and an almost instant short-term response. So think of dopamine as like instant gratification, whereas oxytocin is more so going to cue us to lean in, which we'll see creates a cascade of more and more nurturing, relational, and pro-social behavior. So oxytocin synthesis is mostly in our central nervous system, more specifically the hypothalamus, but it can be synthesized elsewhere in the body. I mean, think about childbirth, right? So during childbirth, oxytocin might be synthesized in, say, the uterine system or the ovaries. But really, research started seeing that, yes, that will create less sensation of pain in that area, which is one of the functions I'll go over in a minute. But it also cues the hypothalamus to synthesize more oxytocin. So again, we have change throughout our body that really amplify the response, because the oxytocin we would get in our reproductive system might have trouble breaking the blood-brain barrier. So really we get the best effect when it's synthesized in our central nervous system, in our hypothalamus. When and why do we get oxytocin? Well, it's triggered by external cues, very specifically pro-social or relational cues. So some of those have to do with childbirth. And again, we want to preserve the human species, right? So we have natural things within us. That oxytocin system is that thing that drives us to want to procreate and to tend for our offspring. If right now I pulled out a puppy, you might think, oh my God, that's so cute, I want to pet it. Well, that's oxytocin. The other thing is, during a relational moment, we're going to get oxytocin. So pro-social stimuli or relationally relevant is going to be a term that I throw around a lot today. Different relationally relevant cues will also release oxytocin in my brain. So that happens in safe contexts. And I want to differentiate something here. If I'm in my apartment with my partner and we're having a conversation, that's a safe space. That's my space. And that's someone that I love. So I'm going to sit in that conversation, lean in, which is going to give me more oxytocin, which will create more empathetic listening and more maybe leaning into, see what's going on with them, which will also release more oxytocin. That also has a relationship with dopamine. I'm being rewarded for that social interaction in my brain. Now, on the contrary, what if I'm in an unsafe situation with someone that I love, maybe my child, or similarly a partner, a parent, or a friend? Think of a mama bear when her young are there and a predator crosses the path. Well, they need to go into protector mode. So oxytocin can also be coupled with vasopressin when we perceive the environment as unsafe. And that's actually going to inform protective and sometimes aggressive behavior. So when I'm referring to oxytocin here, throughout, it's going to become abundantly clear that I mean in a safe environment, because otherwise it actually has totally different functions. Functions of oxytocin are bonding, increasing interpersonal trust, reducing anxiety, reducing our stress response cycle, reducing immune and inflammation or inflammatory responses. It also alters memory. Again, think about childbirth. Anyone who's had a child can probably attest to the fact that they know it was painful, but they lose that memory. Well, that's because our body wants us to do that again. So it's going to alter the memory, especially around the sensation of pain. And overall, it reduces pain. You know, I remember as a kid, if I fell and scraped my knee, a caregiver coming and giving me a hug would actually take that pain away. Well, that's oxytocin. Another thing I thought was super interesting in the research is oxytocin is species dependent in terms of how much we naturally have and also how much is released. And it has to do with our reproductive behavior. So at baseline, humans have way more oxytocin than rabbits. And think of rabbits in their mating and reproductive behavior. They have tons of partners and they have a baby and then it's kind of on its own, right? They don't really attune to the young in the same way. Us humans, we have our young for 18 plus years that we have to care for them. So our body naturally has a more sensitive oxytocin system because it wants to reward us for tending to our young so we can continue to keep it safe. And even think of our culture. I mean, we live in very, close proximity to each other. I live in an apartment quite literally stacked on top of other people. That said, we need each other to survive. We can't really raise our young alone. We thrive in close proximity to others. So we have more oxytocin so that we're encouraged, to do more of that because we need to bond and lean into relationships more than other species. So in terms of the development of the oxytocin system, this is also really important to understand because how the oxytocin system develops is going to dictate how sensitive it is and how oxytocin is both synthesized and released. So there's a lot of things that can impede or impact our oxytocin system development, and that's going to play a role in our relational behavior. I find myself to be pretty relationally driven. So maybe that means I have a sensitive oxytocin system where when I'm around other people, I get more oxytocin, which informs me wanting to lean in. I'm trusting, I'm empathetic. Now, what if I had early childhood attachment trauma? What if from a young age, I associated people and more specifically caregivers with fear? Well, then I'd be more prone to that vasopressin response, the protective behavior rather than the leaning in, dopamine reward driven behavior. So an underdeveloped oxytocin system and coupling of attachment and danger is going to lead to oftentimes poor interpersonal bonding, which means less resilience in the face of stress. Because if you think about those functions, reducing anxiety, reducing stress was one of them. So if I'm not getting as much oxytocin, I'm not feeling that same benefit. And that might lead to higher rates of addiction, which we'll talk about as we proceed. And the other thing in terms of risk for addiction, when the sensitivity is compromised, it's going to increase the drive to reward-seeking behavior. And I'll give you an example. So sticking with that early childhood trauma, let's say a caregiver was abusive or neglectful, and I made an association that connection is unsafe. Well, then if I'm hurting, if I need soothing and someone comes towards me, I'm going to go into protection mode and I don't get that soothing. In fact, that's going to bump up my anxiety even more. So then I have all this anxiety, relationships aren't soothing it. Well, then that means I might seek something external to push that down, right? To give me that relief, which could lead to substance use. Some potential experiences that impact the development are prenatal exposure to stress, prenatal exposure to substances, like I mentioned, early childhood attachment injury, experimentation with substances as an adolescent, any sort of trauma, both adult and childhood or adolescent, adult substance use, and then adult reproductive behavior actually enhances the development of the oxytocin system and can increase sensitivity in the research that I found. So I want to just also point out neuroplasticity. Our brain is like a lump of clay. So yes, if you have clients you're working with childhood attachment injuries and childhood trauma, that could put them at a higher propensity for addiction, right? And could mean that they have difficulty in social situations or responding to pro-social stimuli. However, what's normalized is important. So, even I'm in residential as well at Mountainside, and I think about people who were in total isolation before now belong to a community. That's going to be inherently healing to their oxytocin system as they're being encouraged to lean in and to bond and to trust and to be vulnerable and to feel other people's empathy as well as, give empathy. So yes, these things can impede the development, but there is hope for repair. We can always normalize different things and increase healing with the people that we work with. All right, so more on oxytocin and its benefits. Of course, it's related to healthy relationships, right? So many of those functions are relational. So of course, oxytocin begets oxytocin in a way, right? If I have high satisfaction of the relationship that I'm in, I'm more, prone to lean in more, which means more oxytocin. So studies are looking at high relationship satisfaction being connected to high levels of oxytocin. You'll see in a minute that that's not always true though. There's also sometimes high levels of oxytocin in low relationship satisfaction. But overall, healthy relationships often mean high amounts of oxytocin. But beyond just benefiting relationships, there's also physiological benefits of oxytocin and healthy relationships. A lot of data looks at, people who are in, say, loving marriages or have strong family supports are also physically healthier. And if you remember those functions, that makes a lot of sense. Because think of, mitigating stress and anxiety, lower heart rate, lower blood pressure, less inflammation, less immune response. Well, that means a healthier physical body as well. And research is looking at how oxytocin is likely going to play a role in that. So healthy relationships are really holistically beneficial. They improve one's physical health as well as one's mental health and maybe even spiritual health. So as mentioned, a lot of the functions of oxytocin are relational, right? And actually it's essential to bonding. And that said, very early research in oxytocin was really looking at caregiver attachment. So, a parent or mother and infant bonding. And through looking at that, they were able to see how important it is to have interpersonal attachments. I know, in my early career, in psych classes, they had talked a lot about different attachment theories and how humans are social creatures. Well, yes, that's so true. And oxytocin plays a role in that. Some studies even look at the relationally relevant context as being really important. And one of which that I found really interesting was that babies had higher levels of oxytocin when they were breastfed than bottle-fed breast milk. So if you think about that skin-to-skin contact is going to release a bigger quantity of oxytocin than, say, the same exact breast milk, which breast milk in itself triggers the release of oxytocin. But without that caregiver, without that other person, that skin to skin, it's still being released just less in less quantities. And studies look at the role of oxytocin now in adult relationships. We're really starting to look at this. And in most studies reviewed, regardless of the relationship structure, so whether it's parent-child, friends, colleagues, romantic relationships, oxytocin is in larger quantities when we're around other people. The main point here being we thrive in connection and close proximity with others. And there's a couple things I think about as to why this is important for us as treatment providers. One, I think about AA and NA and other fellowships where sometimes people benefit from fellowship even if they don't work the steps. And if you think about why that is, maybe that's just belonging. Belonging is a very powerful force in terms of oxytocin and its benefits. So just being around other people, we're going to feel physically healthier. We're going to have more resilience around stress and triggers and find benefit in that. The other thing is something I'm going to keep talking about throughout our hour together is the importance of involving families in treatment. This becomes important too. There's a huge difference between talking about your marriage individually with a clinician versus having a session with your loved one and talking about your marriage to them or with them, even alongside them. So context matters. Now, I mentioned that not all data pointed in the same direction. And that was something that the specific team, Holt, Lundstad, Birmingham, and Light, found to be really interesting, where across studies looking at oxytocin and relationship satisfaction, there was a split. Some studies were showing that the higher level of oxytocin found, the higher relationship satisfaction, whereas other were the opposite. Higher oxytocin levels meant lower relationship satisfaction. And they wondered why. Is that data contradictory, or could there be more behind that? And they found out it was the latter. There's just more behind it. They came up with two different theories, common connect and tend and befriend, that speak to why oxytocin levels are the way they are. So common connect is that positive correlation. So the higher my relationship satisfaction, the higher my oxytocin levels. They postulate that oxytocin is going to inhibit negative relational behavior, so less anxiety, less defensiveness, while promoting more nurturing behavior. So more intimacy emotionally, more empathy, more warmth, more desire for physical closeness. Well, that makes sense. And this makes the point of oxytocin begets oxytocin. If I see my partner in high regard, or I see my parent in high regard, and I see our relationship in high regard, I have high relationship satisfaction, well, then I'm going to go to them more. And in going to them and talking to them and being warm and empathetic and going in for that hug, well, that increases more oxytocin, which also makes me feel more bonded to them. So here we have a positive feedback loop. Higher oxytocin level, more drive to seek out that relationship, more oxytocin, more drive to seek out that relationship. Now the inverse. The negative association, they postulate that that's the gap in the relationship. So the presence of anxiety, crisis, or stress. And what they saw was anxiety or crisis or stress actually drives the person to seek affection and repair in the threatened relationship, which increases oxytocin. I think this is what we work with a lot. I know for me in my work with families and couples where one or more member is in early recovery, there's sometimes a lot of strain and tension, right? Where maybe there's conflict, maybe there's anxiety in the relationship, and they're both seeing not a lot of satisfaction. I think a lot that communication breakdown is a really common thing that we see in active addiction. So that said, maybe I'm viewing my relationship as neither of us are satisfied. Well, that might make me want to seek to repair, but moving forward, I want to be close to you. I want to have a healthy relationship. So then I go towards that person, which releases more oxytocin. So if you were to look at my brain, I'd have pretty high levels of oxytocin, even though I'm still seeing the relationship down here. The other thing is, think about sober support networks. Think about fellowship here. Maybe in that gap, I have a lot of anxiety. I think that my partner is upset with me. We just got in a fight. I go seek out support. And I hear stories, various, varieties of this here at Mountainside where, I just got in a fight with my friend or my partner. And then they go seek out support from the rest of the community. They talk to one of their peers and the peer says, yeah, me too. That happened to me last week. And, this is what I did. That's going to increase the oxytocin level. So sometimes if there's a perceived threat in the relationship, if there's low relationship satisfaction, that actually drives me to seek out external support. So I'm going to go look for closeness outside of the relationship. I'm going to go get some TLC from a peer or from my clinician or something like that, which still increases oxytocin. So as we see here, these models are not really in conflict with one another. Actually, they just look at the vulnerability of the relationship. And for those of us working in the early recovery process, we're going to be encountering a lot of relationships that are in a transitional moment. This is a context of change. So this is really important for us to consider. The interventions I give with a common connect or attend and befriend couple are going to be radically different. I can ask common connect to turn towards each other and say a statement of gratitude or something like that. Whereas tend and befriend, they might not be ready for that. We might be more looking at the parallel process, including a bit of separation, so to speak, where one focuses on themselves, the other focuses on themselves. They're seeking out support from their fellowship network. They're seeking out support from their fellowship network. So as providers, having this information, I found really invigorating for my work of considering where's the relationship satisfaction and how can I still increase oxytocin while being person-centered without trying to push closeness too fast or maybe even make more stress, more anxiety in that process. So the nature of the intervention, and as well as the oxytocin levels being the way they are, likely does have a lot to do with the relationship satisfaction. And again, it's just an important consideration for us as practitioners working in the field of addiction. So oxytocin is a risk or protective factor for addiction, and that's something that was really exciting to discover because we're always looking for more protective factors, right? All of our clients have risk factors, so how can we stack the protective factors? Well, everything starts with animal studies, I'm sure you know, before we get to human studies, and animal studies have been doing a lot of work here. And they start to show conclusive data that further, human research needs to happen, but also that oxytocin itself, and due to some overlapping mechanisms, really do break some of the loops, such as what the pleasure principle does, that can really go a long way in treating addiction. So one of the compelling studies I found was in rodents, and these rodents had a setup to be able to self-administer cocaine. And what they saw was there was a ritualistic repetitive behavior that the rodents started doing, where it was they do these like face, hand, nose movements, touch the lever, and then rub their face again. And that was like the whole ritual. And if we think of our human clients, I hear stories about this a lot, where my clients say, I felt a rush in just driving on the street or just rolling up that dollar bill. There are ritualistic and repetitive things that happen that kind of create the whole holistic behavior involved in substance use. That said, when these rodents were administered, again, exogenous, so administered rather than, given a hug or something like that, oxytocin in very high quantities, they stopped the repetitive behavior and they also stopped self-administering the cocaine, which the researchers were blown away by and started wondering why. And so they looked at the brain. While the mice or rodents were doing those ritualistic behaviors, the part of the brain that was lighting up was the corticostriatal loop. Now, the corticostriatal thalamic circuit, it's a chain of neurons in our brain that connects the prefrontal cortex to the basal ganglia and the hypothalamus in one continuous loop. This is the part of human brains that gets overactive for people with OCD that tend towards those ritualistic behaviors. And it's a main structure that's responsible for us for impulse, as well as habit formation and ritual and tradition formation for us. What they saw was oxytocin breaks the loop. And remember that the corticostriatal loop has to do with the hypothalamus. Oxytocin is synthesized in the hypothalamus for us humans. So if you think about it, here's this loop, right? And it's achieving, that function of creating, that ritual. Now I start asking the hypothalamus to do its job with oxytocin, it starts lighting up, it breaks that loop. If it's busy synthesizing oxytocin to create that relational prosocial behavior, that loop can't continue. So it breaks that circuit, which is really powerful when we think of why the opposite of addiction is connection. And similarly, even outside of cocaine, which when we look at rodents, the ritualistic behavior was even heightened with cocaine versus other substances. But even animal studies that were giving opiates and other substances, even when there weren't the same, eye or hand movement, they still stopped pressing the lever with high levels of oxytocin. So it seems to not only break that loop, but it also kind of desensitizes the person to want to seek out that rewarding substance. And I think a lot because oxytocin is rewarding. It gives us a good feeling. So in those rodents, maybe they were less inclined to seek out the opiate because they had lower levels of pain, because oxytocin reduces pain, or emotional pain because oxytocin reduces anxiety. So all of those functions really decouple that association that our pleasure principle makes of I need this dopamine, this stimulus, because I'm getting all these rewards somewhere else. And again, it's really due to some of those overlapping mechanisms. So research in the brain is really starting to look at what are these overlapping mechanisms. Yes, the corticostriatal loop or the corticostriatal thalamatic circuit is a big piece of that, but there's more. And the more we look at the brain, the more we realize it truly oxytocin and healthy relationships are protective factors. So it's alluded to, as I just mentioned, mitigating some of the having mitigating properties for addiction because it breaks that reward association around substances. And I mentioned at the beginning when we were looking at the hijacked brain that glutamate and dopamine are really important to understand. Well, oxytocin appears to impact the glutamatergic system as well. So what I mean by that is glutamate receptors get pretty blasted, as do dopamine receptors through continued use. And when they looked at brains administered high amounts of oxytocin, we see glutamate and dopamine restoring. So over continued use, actually what happens is people are waking up in the morning in a deficit because all the dopamine, even the little amount that we all have when we wake up in the morning that just kind of gets us out of bed, it's all being synthesized, which again drives that person to seek out more of the substance, right? Well, when we look at oxytocin, it's returning people to baseline, which again is making it that voice, that calling of go find that substance, that thing that's going to make you feel so good. That voice is getting quieter if something else is filling in that gap. If again, the levels are returning to baseline. So that's pretty powerful data as well. Beyond that, we know that oxytocin reduces anxiety and stress, which subsequently builds resilience around triggers, thus reducing the rates of recurrence. I think about, let's say I'm driving home from work and I'm in early recovery and I drive by a liquor store. I see that liquor store, anxiety comes up. I've made that association in the past, and maybe even I want to hold on to my sobriety so bad that I get anxious. Now, I'm all alone. There's no oxytocin to be found. I might be susceptible to that trigger. I might turn into that package store. What if I'm in the car with a friend and we're laughing and we're singing and we're listening to music and we're having a good time and I have oxytocin on board? Well, I drive by that same exact liquor store and that oxytocin stops that anxiety from rising. It stops my blood pressure from rising. All those physiological factors, as well as I love them. I feel trust. I feel bonded to that person next to me. Maybe then I keep that car driving forward, right? As well as the accountability of having the person there. But even physiologically and neurologically, think about how all those functions can really create a more resilient person, somebody who's more apt to use coping skills. So human studies are showing that oxytocin also reduces cravings and reduces withdrawal symptoms. They started looking at human participants that were in detox facilities, and they looked at humans that were addicted to alcohol and humans that were addicted to cocaine. And this particular study I looked at was still in exogenous administration. So again, they kind of provided oxytocin rather than it being with a prosocial cue. But nonetheless, they looked at self-report data, lower levels of craving, lower levels of withdrawal, even post-acute withdrawal symptoms, which we know can be huge in terms of risk factor for recurrence after leaving residential. This blew me away. And again, I thought of the functions. If I have less physical pain, yeah, I probably won't seek out that opiate, like I said before. Or if I'm less stressed out, if I feel connected, maybe I'm getting that love, that reward, and stops me from having a recurrence. So here are some things that increase oxytocin naturally. Yoga and meditation. And here at Mountainside, we have a lot of holistic nature to our program. And I say all the time to my colleagues that I feel so blessed to work with clients who have just had yoga. And I notice the difference. They walk into my office more open, more attuned, they lean in. Well, that's because they have oxytocin on board. And remember, oxytocin begets oxytocin. So they do yoga, they feel really good, they have that oxytocin, they come sit down on my couch, and they're more prone to be vulnerable. And then, maybe I ask them a question, they respond more, and we get more out of therapy. So I love having that as part of my, clinical work here. Also things like music, both listening to it and creating it, that's going to release oxytocin. Physical touch is big here. Cuddling, hugging, massage, sexual behavior. During orgasm, a lot of oxytocin is released as well. Same thing with emotional closeness, sharing positive feelings, spending time with your friends, listening empathetically, doing selfless deeds. That's going to release oxytocin. Even cooking and eating together. And remember, food is one of those things that also releases dopamine. So cooking and eating together, that could be something that you recommend to families and couples you work with as well, as a kind of a double whammy, so to speak. It increases their dopamine levels, but also might increase their oxytocin levels. And then playing with pets as well. A lot of research shows that pets, dogs, cats, anything, petting them, but also just having them, having that relationship, that's a relationship. And, even the word family is so not one size fit all. I've worked with clients that their pets are their family. So I'm going to encourage you to go snuggle with your pet as a way to increase oxytocin. Before I take it a step further, I'm just seeing some activity here in the chat. Does the aging body still produce oxytocin? Yes. I actually, in this research, some of it was looking at older adults as well as children. And it looks like throughout our lifespan, we get oxytocin. Now, do remember that certain life experiences impacted sensitivity and synthesis. So older adults maybe have a higher risk of trauma just from having more life. So things like that are important to consider, that they might have made some associations that could impede the sensitivity of their oxytocin system. But also, they also maybe have had kids, and then that helps heal the oxytocin system. Kennels, have you social behaviors help dogs? Yes, absolutely, Kathy. I saw some of that too, that dogs that were in a lot of pain, oxytocin has been administered to pets as like a more holistic, so to speak, way to reduce inflammation and pain. Can you expand a little bit on oxytocin release during orgasm with men versus women? So I didn't see much data that differentiated, but I do know when I was looking at things like childbirth, that in the female reproductive system, we have more areas that do synthesize oxytocin. So we have the uterus, we have the ovaries, we have the external genitalia as well. Whereas with the more male sex organs, there's less, so to speak, in terms of synthesis. It's just the testes. I didn't see anything otherwise. So unfortunately, I don't think I can answer that question more than that, but I can say that people who are biologically born with female sex organs, they might have more areas in their body in which oxytocin can be synthesized. So therefore, more is released. Whereas men, again, less areas in the body or I should say male sex organs, less areas in the body to release it. Plus, again, in terms of reproductive behavior, oxytocin is really important for uterus havers who are child rearing, because again, it's going to help encourage more. It's going to make us want to preserve the species, which we got to preserve the species, right? Our brain is built to do that. So hopefully that answers some of those questions that were coming in. And I'll look back towards the end here. So for our clinical implications, we want to build oxytocin producing activities into session and in our wellness plans. What's being done between sessions? In the moment, in the session, I want them to turn towards each other. I want to have connective moments. But when they go home, let's also consider oxytocin. What if I prescribe, so to speak, a couple to every day spend at least 5 minutes alternating, sharing about your day and listening and leaning into each other? How good would that be for improving relationship satisfaction? Really good, right? So not just in the therapy room, we want to give them homework too, to get that oxytocin up. We'll encourage them to lean in more, but also probably get them more open when they're in session with us. We want to encourage, I cannot say this enough, include the family in the treatment. In really old school, pre-modern and modern family systems theory, a lot of times they'd say, if not all member of the family is here, we're not even doing the session. And that had merit. And the reason why is because we really want to involve everyone. So include the family members when you can, encourage things like empathetic listening, hugging and massage when we can and when it's clinically relevant, which I'll say more about in a minute. And explore support networks. And specific to addiction, I can't say this enough. Mutual support is so important, not just for the clients, right? Yes, we want them in fellowship, AA, AA, NA, refuge recovery, SMART, whatever it be, in intensive outpatient group therapy, but also for the families. We want them to engage in support groups, Al-Anon, Nar-Anon, Learn to Cope, Families Anonymous. Mountainside has offerings for our clients. If other treatment centers have offerings for the family members as well, that can go a really long way in terms of, again, that parallel process. They're seeking their supports outside of the relationship. They're seeking supports outside of their relationship, more oxytocin to encourage more togetherness. Now, in terms of clinical interventions, we want to try to integrate as much as we can in sessions. And even before I started thinking about oxytocin, Dr. David Schnarch, his book, Passionate Marriage, Keeping Love and Intimacy Alive in Committed Relationships, talks about this intervention called hugging until relaxed. And I didn't think about oxytocin at first, but now I realize how much this is about oxytocin. He says, stand on your own 2 feet, put your arms around your partner, focus on yourself and quiet yourself down. Well, what I now understand in that is I'm feeling anxious. I put my arms around my partner. That physical touch releases oxytocin, which brings my anxiety down. Co-regulation is about oxytocin. I'm not asking them to do the work for me. I'm not asking them to take my anxiety away. Just being near me is enough for my body to do that work. I do that work. That empowers me to make that meaning. So really big, if you start thinking about kind of maybe things that we've all heard that make even more sense now as we're talking about oxytocin. In your sessions, get experiential with it. This is something that I do in almost all of my family sessions, even in COVID era, where it was virtual. Oxytocin can still be huge. I ask members of my couple or my family to turn towards one another, give eye contact, even through the computer screen if needed, and say a statement of gratitude for either that person or what they accomplished. And, I get chills every time, truly, where, it meant so much to me when you said this. It means so much to me that you're still supporting me through everything we've been through. It's beautiful. I feel oxytocin in that moment. So I can imagine how strong that connection is for the 2 people leaning into one another. So us as providers, start thinking about that. How can you encourage more oxytocin, which can encourage empathy, understanding, less anxiety, and again, more resilience? So speaking of that, as a provider, I am an agent of change. You're an agent of change. And there's a lot for us to consider here with oxytocin. My alliance, my rapport is a source of oxytocin. At home, if things are stressed out, you come into this office, you feel safe, you feel like someone cares, someone is attuned to you. That's a source of oxytocin. That's a source of resilience against stress and propensity for a recurrence. So it's up to us to be that source. Let's lean in, let's create emotional safety. Let's be a model of secure attachment for our clients. More so, think of your context. If you can see behind me, my office looks a lot like a living room. I love that. I think that's here for a reason. And all the time, clients walk in and they say, oh, wow, it's really nice in here. It feels really cozy in here. Well, then it's a safe environment. Remember what I said about vasopressin. Consider where your practice location is. Is there sirens outside? Are there gunshots outside? That could be dysregulating for a client and make meaning that it's unsafe. What about really clinical, like hospital type settings? Maybe they have trauma around hospitals, and that's again bringing up vasopressin coupled with the oxytocin. That's not going to make them very vulnerable in the session. That might bring up a lot of guardedness and defensiveness. So try to make sure your office is cozy. You can have blankets, you can have pillows, have some swag. If you work with the queer population, try to have a rainbow or something somewhere. Let people know that you're safe and that the space is safe. And consider who attends the session. As I've said a whole bunch of times, and I'll probably say more, try to include everyone you can in the treatment process. And the last thing I'll go over here before wrapping us up and going into more questions is the self of the therapist work is huge here. Self of the relational therapist. How much am I taking care of myself? That's important. If I'm frazzled walking into session because the session I had before was really challenging, I'm probably not leaning in. I'm probably anxious, and I might not be that conduit for connection. So we need to take care of ourselves as providers, right? I need to know my signature themes. Where do I get triggered? When do I get triggered? And so that I can soothe myself in those moments. We need self-awareness and to promote self-care and self-well-being, right? The degree in which I can regulate is really the degree in which I can model regulation, as well as be that secure attachment to my clients. So as clinicians, we got to look at our own measures of self-care. Do I have quality supervision? Am I going to my peers for peer-to-peer? You know, there's been times where I had a challenging day and I went and asked a peer for a hug. I needed that oxytocin and I thank them for that. That's okay. And in fact, I'd say that's really important for us to have that advocacy and awareness if we're asking our clients to do that. So last thing just to consider, we need to meet our clients where we're at, and there's no one size fit all. I mean, think of touch. Some clients touch is going to, stimulate reciprocity and oxytocin, which again is going to put up that wall, maybe aggressive or protective behavior. So really consider where your client's at and any sort of contraindications that could happen when you're giving these interventions. So be person-centered and trauma-informed when we're looking at oxytocin. Like, what stage of change are they at? If my couple's at pre-contemplation and they're really at odds with each other, I'm not going to ask them to hug. That's not going to work, right? So think their trauma history, stage of change, their family dynamics, what supports they have outside of the relationship. Where should we be encouraging support towards each other or outside of the relationship? So in summary here, substance use hijacks the brain in the natural reward circuit. Increased levels of oxytocin is linked to neurochemical responses that decrease cravings and rehijack the hijacked brain, which is really exciting for us as caring professionals, always looking for ways to improve our treatment. Oxytocin has other health benefits, right? Healthy relationships, but also physiological benefits. And interventions that support deepening meaningful connection also support recovery process. So it improves our treatment outcomes as well as the outcomes for the clients. And I can say that, we do a lot of outcomes measures where I work, and our conclusive data has shown that, clients that involve their families in treatment have less instances of recurrence. So we can see the benefit of that. So really consider that in your work. Now I'm going to leave up my contact information if anybody has any additional questions, but I'm also going to scroll up. I know we only have a few minutes, but I'm going to scroll up and see if there's any other questions here I can answer. Oh, I want to just highlight, I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but I think it's Jamika. She said when her son with autism gets overwhelmed, she hugs him and it calms him down. That's beautiful and such a good measure of the benefits of oxytocin, just that touch. Great for the relationship, great for the symptomology. Oxytocin and codependence. I could talk for 3 hours on this, but I'll be brief. We want to be cognizant of that. I think codependence has very high correlation to addiction, right? So a lot of our clients are really seeking that sensation. Sensation seeking is a big piece of it. So we want to have balance here. I'm not saying tell your clients to go hug everybody in the community, right? Not only is that not COVID safe, but that could lead to other problems. So we want balance here. We need to balance individuality and togetherness, two opposing forces that are really hard to balance. Codependence is too much togetherness. So think of what I said with Schnarch about co-regulation. It's not about having you do my regulating work for me. It's more so using you as a source of warmth so that my body regulates itself. So I think that's the elevator speech of the relationship between oxytocin and codependence, but such a good question. And I wish I could say more about that. And yes,
Gabby, this was amazing. What a great webinar. I really enjoyed it. And I know that all of our listeners did. I don't know if you just answered it, but did you answer the one about balance promoting oxytocin and codependence?
I'm just in my elevator speech right there, but I wish I could say more about that.
Okay.
Balance.
Well, that's fine. What I'm going to do is I just want to say thank you to everybody who joined us today. I will put Gabrielle's contact information in the email, so you will be able to contact her. The webinar will absolutely be able to be utilized on our website. I'll have it up by end of day Friday, so y'all can get to that. Gabrielle, thank you.
Thank you for having
I
me.
hope you'll come back and see us because I feel like you have a lot more to share with this group, and they certainly absolutely enjoyed having you. So best to everybody. We're rolling into September. Details coming out on the next webinar as soon as I can get them out to you. We'll see you into September. And Gabrielle, have a great day.
Thank you guys so much for coming.
Bye,
I really
everybody.
appreciate
Thank
it.
you.